The show here on Friday afternoons is Connecting Flights. On the Fridays when I host, the theme is Jamaican and Jamaican-influenced music, while on the other Fridays, Chad Daly takes listeners across all 7 continents with his distinct take on world music. My show is about musical cross-pollination between Jamaica and particularly the United States and United Kingdom. Today I have a special show for you focused on a key moment in the late 70s, early 1980s, a time when British musicians were doing something new and exciting with Jamaican influences. There was a record label, a musical movement really, called Two-Tone, and in keeping with that name, nearly all of the Two-Tone bands were biracial. Now, whenever I do one of these special shows, I get an expert to serve as our guide. This time it's music writer Daniel Rachel, author of an excellent recent book about Two-Tone titled Too Much Too Young. I'll be playing clips from my recent conversation with Daniel. The Two-Tone story starts with Jerry Dammers of Britain's motor city of Coventry. He formed Two-Tone's standard-bearing band, The Specials, and launched the record label. Daniel Rachel was fortunate to have Dammers' cooperation for the book. First off, I asked Daniel about Jerry Dammers' overall musical idea for The Specials. Bringing you a special about The Specials on Connecting Flights on 90 FM.
Well, British ska is very distinct from its Jamaican equivalent in as much as it relies upon not only the influence of the Caribbean island sound, but critically rock, disco and punk. And all of that plays a huge part in the transition, particularly from the Coventry Automatics to the Specials. In as much as initially Jerry Dammers wanted the Coventry Automatics to be playing reggae with then a rock feel. They were trying to do reggae with rock music, but unlike what, say, for example, the Wailers initially did, it wasn't to try and combine together. It was to go from one, to have a section of reggae and then go into a section of rock, then go back to reggae. And they couldn't work out how to do that. So by the time Jerry Dammers had recruited additional members to the band, to the 7 members we now know as the Specials, that also coincided with a more fluent integration of influences, particularly moving from reggae to ska, because ska and rock are on the same 4/4 rhythm. But then into that, you had the disco bass lines and funk bass lines of Horace Panter. You had the kind of the punk guitar of Roddy Radiation, the very punk approach of Terry Hall. Yeah, so that British ska sound are all those influences into one.
We also talked about key early influences and the tunes that helped shape Jerry Dammers' musical vision. Take a listen to Daniel Rachel's answer and then the influential tracks themselves, starting with the Wailers' Mr. Brown, here on 90 FM.
Mr. Brown was originally in the Specials or the Coventry Automatics set. I think that was probably an influence of direction, that, as who wouldn't be influenced by the Wailers? That's very natural. But the importance of Smoking My Ganja by capital letters was huge on Jerry Dammers, because that gave him the inspiration to switch from a reggae influence to a ska influence. It's more difficult to hear that because I always think Smoking My Ganja has a more obvious reggae sound. But interesting enough, I remember going to see Rankin Roger of The Beat one time at his house, and he said, "Do you know this track? You've got to hear this track." And it was Smoking My Ganja, and he was equally influenced by it, maybe because they were a Midlands band. The inclusion of the Sex Pistols is, well, one, because I went to see Jerry Dammers DJ in, when would it have been, the early 2000s, at a soul jazz night in London. And he was playing an eclectic choice of music. And to my surprise, he played the Sex Pistols. And I just thought, brilliant, because I love the Sex Pistols. And it just felt so exciting to hear that in the context of a kind of an electronic reggae dubbed vibe club. And then suddenly here was the Pistols, with Jerry grinning his toothless grin from behind the DJ deck.
After the Wailers' Mr. Brown, you heard the Sex Pistols with Anarchy in the UK, and then just now Smoking My Ganja from Capital Letters. If you can hold that sound in your head and your ears for a bit, I think you'll hear the influence that had on the music of today in our two-tone special. So it was in the spring and summer of 1979 that the Specials found their audience with a breakout hit called Gangsters. Here's another clip from my recent conversation with Daniel Rachel, author of the new authoritative history of two-tone, Too Much Too Young.
In fact, when Gangsters was originally pressed by the band themselves, they were able to sell copies direct to the shop Rough Trade in West London. But really the success of Gangsters is because of the inclusion of Rough Trade, and thereafter when Chrysalis distributed the record and got involved. So it has a kind of there's several levels and reasons why it became successful. The story goes that they didn't have enough money to record a B-side, but the truth is that they actually recorded 3 songs, and only Gangsters was any good. So Too Much Too Young could easily have been that first single, but but it just wasn't up to scratch. And early demos and some live recordings in that era certainly cement or concur with that idea, because they're just they sound weak. Somehow they pulled it together with Gangsters. More surprisingly, I think, is the vocal of Terry Hall, because it's especially strong on Gangsters, but on the live recordings, really up until October 79, his voice is one of the weakest parts of the band. You know, if you listen to Live at the Moonlight, it's not strong. But by the time he does the first two-tone tour and the live version of Too Much Too Young, which is recorded at the beginning of December 79, his voice has transformed unbelievably in such a short amount of months. And having been a singer myself, I know that idea that the more you tour and play live, the stronger your voice comes. And that's so noticeable in Terry Hall.
So the references to Rough Trade and Chrysalis were the record companies that Jerry Dammers and the Specials were dealing with. Rough Trade being an alternative label, and then Chrysalis being more of a major label. But speaking of financial struggles, there was a bona fide gangster in the story of Gangsters, as Daniel Rachel explains.
Then they found their own gangster in the form of Jim O'Boyle in Coventry, who agreed to give the Specials a loan to record Gangsters. And on the meeting where he handed over the money to Roddy and Terry, there in the glove compartment of the car was a handgun. And tales of the last person that didn't pay dug their own grave.
All right, time to finally hear this classic tune, but I'm going to lead into it with another classic from when ska first emerged in Jamaica, the Prince of Ska, Prince Buster's Al Capone. I'm sure you'll hear the resemblance here on Connecting Flights on 90 FM, your only alternative. You'll indulge me on this next one as I play one more tune related to the song Gangsters. And this is in connection with my obsession with The Clash for the last, 45 years or so. There's a name check in the Gangsters lyrics that goes, Bernie Rhodes knows, don't argue. Bernie Rhodes was very active as a manager of bands at the height of punk rock, including The Clash, off and on. That lyric about Bernie knowing what's best really fits with his rep as an aggressively opinionated, at times tyrannical figure. Author Daniel Rachel and I talked about Bernie in our conversation. I'm going to play that clip. Then a Clash song inspired by Bernie Rhodes. Poking fun at Bernie is probably more accurate. The tune is Complete Control. The title comes from the Clash band members being highly amused by Rhodes' insistence on keeping control. In my mind, I picture him stamping his feet. All for you on this special edition of Connecting Flights on 90 FM, your only alternative.
The specials went through a brief period before the release of Gangsters with management, many managers, but Bernie Rhodes probably gets the greatest notoriety for his refusal to let the band play for 6 months, locked them in a room and told them to become better.
Now we're going to hear Daniel Rachel talk about the next two-tone group that launched after the specials did. They were called The Selector. They lasted only a short time, and they were fronted by a woman named Pauline Black. A fun fact about this band is that they released a single before they even really existed. Their founder, Neil Davies, had a track in the works prior to fully forming the band's lineup, and that track was picked as the B-side for the specials hit Gangsters. I'll let Daniel explain.
Yeah, but that idea that the specials recorded 3 songs and only one of them was good enough meant that they were faced with a potentially empty B-side. In stepped Lynval Golding, who persuaded members of a band called Hard Top 22 and Pauline Black, who was a folk singer, to become the band The Selector. And this was an instrumental track that guitarist Neil Davis had orchestrated with the help of a trombone player that worked in a sweet shop and the drummer of the nascent specials, John Badbury. And that instrumental track, together with some additional ska rhythm guitar at Jerry Dammer's request, became the default B-side of Gangsters, The Selector, by a band fictitiously at that point called The Selector. The Whisper was the 4th Selector single, and their first one for Chrysalis after they left Two Tone. So it really would have been the next single in line for the band. I think it's my favourite Selector song. Really fantastic melody, great unusual rhythm, and has always been a mystery to me why this wasn't a hit in England. The debut single by the real Selector, On My Radio, Too Much Pressure. What a brilliant double A side, really. I mean, Roger Lomas says that On My Radio, that's the first vocal that Pauline Black ever did in a studio for a rock band. That's take 1, and take 2 is the double track. And Too Much Pressure with Gaps Hendrickson on a joint lead vocal just wonderful. Great single, great band selector. A band that all hated one another and somehow managed to make creative art for 11 months before they really decided they hated each other and had to split up.
Say more, because I know you can, about Pauline.
Pauline Black's a magnificent front singer. She hadn't, to my knowledge, ever fronted a rock band before. She was playing in the back room of pubs with an acoustic guitar, doing Bert Jansch and Joan Armatrading and Joni Mitchell, Sandy Denny kind of acoustic covers. And the idea that she could suddenly front a rock band with 6 men behind her without any experience, and when you watch film footage of that, she gives the impression she's been doing it all her life. Not only was she adopted, she didn't know at this point who what her true heritage was. She'd come from Essex to Coventry, where she had racism within her own family. She was suddenly having to negotiate black people, which hadn't been part of her life. She was mixed race, and she took it all in a stride. That's how she presented herself. What inner turmoil was going on, who only knows? A lot of those clues are in her own book. But she was a welcome face, a woman's face in a male world of two-tone predominantly at this point. And she flew the flag for the equity of women in a male-dominated society.
Today we're sending out a special show focused on the second wave ska movement that sprung up in Britain in the late 1970s, early 1980s. Bands launched by the Two Tone label. Catching you up with the final set of the last hour after the self-titled track The Selector, which, as we said, came out even before the Selector was really formed as a band. Then it was the actual Selector band with their hard-hitting double A-side single, the tracks Too Much Pressure and On My Radio. Wrapping up the set and the hour with The Whisper, which was picked for us by music writer Daniel Rachel, our guest expert and tour guide for today's special show. He is the author or co-author of 7 books, including Too Much Too Young, the Two-Tone Record Story in 2024, as well as the forthcoming This Ain't Rock and Roll, Pop Music, the Swastika, and the Third Reich, due out in February 2026, and of course available for pre-order. In this next clip from our recent conversation, the author talks about the band Madness. By eerie coincidence, they were making very similar music to the Specials, but completely separately in a different part of the country. Daniel will explain that for you. Meanwhile, I've queued up 2 versions of the tune from which the band took their name. The song Madness was recorded by the original Jamaican ska star Prince Buster and covered by the band Madness early in their career, playing both here on the Two Tones special edition of Connecting Flights on 90 FM.
The fact that the Specials and Madness met one another in the summer of 1979, or the spring perhaps, and were carbon copies of one another in the way that they dressed and their influences to a large extent is incredible. I mean, Madness had slightly different influences, as I say, that some of that coming from America more so than the Specials. But the idea that British kids were getting off on Jamaican sounds perhaps isn't so shocking because of the timeline in how Jamaicans and Caribbean kids had arrived in the UK. The first real time they were picking up guitars and forming bands as the Offspring kids was in the mid-70s. But the sharing of a more ska sensibility over reggae is the more intriguing coincidence. But Madness wore their influences and themselves in a lighter suit than Specials. Specials wore heavy suits and a heavy frown, whereas Madness would raise their eyebrows and were more likely to give a smile and a bit of a laugh. But the joviality shrouded a heavier substance which was in their lyricism and actually in them as a gang. The fact that they were white, I don't think, doesn't matter. It's not important. It became important to the press, and it became important to fans and people that were jealous that their success wasn't as great as Madness's success, and it gave a reason for people to say, it's because they're white. I simply think they were the better songwriters over time.
Madness, madness, we call it madness. Madness, madness, they call it madness. Our house, that was where we used to sleep. Our house, in the middle of our street.
Well, we heard music writer Daniel Rachel say what great tunesmiths Madness were, so I wrapped up that set with probably their best-known tune, Our House. In the next clip from my recent conversation with Daniel, he talks about a very tricky challenge the two-tone groups faced as they became more popular, particularly at their live shows. They drew some very violent fans, many of them avowedly racist and fascist.
In the late 70s were very violent. There'd been a clampdown on football, and so a lot of football crowds were coming into the gigs, and then particularly two-tone gigs. And so fights between rival football factions was common, fights between mods and rockers and hippies and punks and whoever else. It was a tribal period, and the different tribes liked to fight. Amongst them were right-wing skinheads, neo-Nazis, and they would happily want to show their symbols and their gestures, which was often Zeke Heiling, and that was all the more strange because the majority of two-tone bands had black members, and these people wouldn't think twice about venting their racist bile to the black fraternity of the bands, and it confused the bands at the time. It confused the managers of the bands, and yet when the music started, so apparently these people danced, so they could live with the contradiction of enjoying the music but not wanting these people perhaps to be their neighbours or live on the same street as them. I think it's a racist idea that has carried forward to today as it did before two-tone. And sadly, this racism infected two-tone from its start until its finish. And you can hear it talked about by the artists in 1979 and in the same way in 1981, when Madness and the Specials both threatened to split up if the violence didn't stop at their gigs.
Just now that was Bed and Breakfast Man from Madness, and before that, Nightclub by the Specials. Both tracks chosen by our guest guide for this special show on the Two-Tone Music Label and Movement, Daniel Rachel, author of The Excellent History of Two-Tone, Too Much, Too Young. I've been playing clips from my recent conversation with Daniel Rachel, and the next one focuses on an OG brass session player whom I featured on this show before. Rico Rodriguez was a Cuban-Jamaican trombonist who played on many of the earliest ska hits. By the 1970s, he had emigrated to Britain, where he agreed to join the Specials as a full-fledged member. This gave the Specials a really cool opportunity. Having Rico play on their cover version of A Message to You, Rudy, when the veteran trombonist had also played on the original a dozen years earlier. I'll play both versions, which will take us up to the local concert update for this weekend. But first, kicking off the set with a Rico cover of a late 1950s American hit, Sea Cruise, and author Daniel Rachel telling a personal story about Rico Rodriguez's version on 90 FM, your only alternative.
It's a magnificent EP, not least because of the extended version of Ghost Town, which gives us the glory of a 3-minute trombone solo by Rico Rodriguez, who I had the great fortune of meeting in the mid-1990s, before I even envisaged becoming a writer when I was a musician myself, and way before the concept of writing Too Much Too Young. And I chatted to Rico about the trombone solo, and in return he signed my copy of my Message to You, Rudy, which I proudly have framed in my toilet. I remember being a schoolboy and walking back one day from school, and saw Sea Cruise in the record shop, and it was quite hard to find that single. And I remember I ran from the record shop 3 miles to my house, ran up the flight of stairs into my bedroom, grabbed the cash I needed to buy the record, and then ran back 3 miles to the record shop. I hadn't even asked them to put it behind the counter. And it's just, it's a kind of my basic stupidity. And unfortunately, it was still there. And so I bought that record. And I think it's, if I remember rightly, it's got Oh Carolina on the other side, hasn't it? The old Folks Brothers song. Rico was from Jamaica and had played on original Prince Buster tracks and various ska records. And quite amazing that he agreed to join the Specials, because at that time he was touring under his own name in the 70s and had formed a relationship with the cornet player, flugelhorn player Dick Cathell, who was producing his records as well. And he agreed to perform on the Specials version of Message to You, Rudy. And, he still had a really strong lip for the trombone and such a distinctive sound, and then stayed with the band. And it just added so much to have Rico and Dick on those records. The combination of that brass was magnificent. Such great players, and really transformed so many of the Special songs. Even the live, to hear the live version of Nightclub with the two of them, it's just brilliant with the extended ideas where they would echo the bass line of Horace's, that it's fantastic. Just great players.
Stop your running about.
We've been going through the history of two-tone British second wave ska with music writer Daniel Rachel as our guide. As we said in the first hour, the history of two-tone is especially the history of its standard-bearing band, the Specials, and Jerry Dammers, who founded the band and the label. But now we've reached the point in the story where the Specials implode. And it happens right around the time that they record perhaps their greatest track, Ghost Town. I'll let Daniel Rachel tell the story, and I'll play the tune for you on Connecting Flights on 90 FM.
Just a fortnight before Charles and Diana got married, and the whole nation seemed to be enthralled by the romance of a royal wedding. And the news leading up and during the reign of Ghost Town at number one was a mixture of royal fanfare and riots across tens and tens of British towns and cities, and the rioting because of police brutality, and the indiscriminate arrests of black youth predominantly for daring to walk on the streets of their hometowns to go about their business. Instead, they got chucked in the back of a Black Maria and arrested. Ghost Town reflects the violence on the streets. It reflects the violence at the gigs. It reflects the violence of the band between one another trying to make the song. It's a song on 3 levels. And Jerry Dammers is talking about all of those 3 levels. That if the fighting doesn't stop, the band will split up. If the fighting doesn't stop at the gigs, the band will split up. And if the fighting doesn't stop on the streets, then everybody will split up. So, it's a clever lyric in succinctly made in just a couple of verses, but it's as much to do with the instrumentation of that song that was so alien to the members of the Specials in the studio, convinced that Jerry had gone mad and was dabbling in heretic chord changes and wailing noises, Arabic wailing noises that wasn't befitting to a band that had already had a number one single. Meanwhile, Terry Hall wanted to record Friday Night, Saturday Morning with just him and an upright piano, like a pub singer, and Jerry wasn't too enthralled by that idea. And the presentation by Neville, Terry and Linville of the third song, Why, that makes up the Ghost Town EP, the demo reveals some brilliant ideas of name-checking lots of different factions and people that could all be united in a world. Sadly, Jerry cut all those lyrics. He had different ideas for the song than its writer Linville, but it's a magnificent EP.
We have 2 more bands left to talk about who were integral to Two Tone Records. Next up is The Beat. They're called the English Beat in America because there was another band at the time in the U.S. who were also called The Beat, but who afterward pretty much faded into obscurity. Once again, we have a clip from my recent conversation with writer Daniel Rachel to introduce the band and take us into a triple shot of their music, kicking off with Save It for Later, here on Connecting Flights on 90 FM.
I love The Beat. What a great band. I love David Steele's invented bass lines that were the formation of so many of their songs, Mirror in the Bathroom, Tristan Crawl. I love the guitar playing of Andy Cox. If you listen to something like Best Friend or Save It for Later, and the almost the influence of the Velvet Underground to me, kind of like What Goes On by the Velvets. It's got that kind of a feel on it. Dave Wakeling would play an open tuned guitar, and the combination of those 2 instruments was really brilliant, and neither the general public or Fine Young Cannibals could capture that intangible magic that they brought to one another. They formed something different, as of course the chemistry of any band would be. But in The Beat, the lyrics of Dave Wakeling were really his sense of fairness, of socialism, of playfulness with words. One of my favourites is Jeanette. I love the rhyming of that, and laundrette and substitute and ronette, and just the wordplay of a Lesser Champion song, perhaps. To me, it's one of their greats. I like all 3 albums as equally for different reasons. Even though Save It for Later, Dave Steele told me when we spoke for Too Much Too Young that Save It for Later had been written before the first album, but he didn't think it was ready to be recorded for the first album, in the same way as they were going to record Mirror in the Bathroom as their first single. But again, David Steele didn't think it was ready. They just needed a little bit longer to nail it. And it's interesting, all the way through the Beats' career, David Steele was always reticent about if they had really nailed the song in the way that he heard it in his brain. I remember talking to him about I Confess, saying, oh, again, a song I really liked. And he said, we didn't nail it. And I really like that about musicians, because they know what they want a final thing to be. We can only say, well, we as fans love it, but you would want that complete thing. But yeah, the beat, absolutely magnificent, really embraced dance music, and perhaps the influence of Talking Heads, where they took the sound of British ska beyond in directions that the original two-tone bands were ever going. And I applaud every inch of that band.
Today I'm doing a special show focused on the second wave ska music that sprung up in Britain in the late 1970s, early 1980s, the bands of the Two-Tone label. And I'm doing it with the help of music writer Daniel Rachel. He's the author of a 2024 book about Two-Tone titled Too Much Too Young, and his 7th book is due out in a couple months. The new one is called This Ain't Rock and Roll, Pop Music, the Swastika, and the Third Reich. Now, just to do our housekeeping from the last hour and the triple shot of tracks from the beat, or English beat. After Save It for Later, you heard Mirror in the Bathroom and Best Friend, bringing us to one last key group in the Two-Tone stable of talent, the all-female group The Bodysnatchers, fronted by Rhoda Dakar. In this next clip, Daniel Rachel talks about Rhoda, the story of the Bodysnatchers, and a very brave, gut-wrenching track about sexual violence called The Boiler. I considered playing it on the air, but ultimately decided not to. I was afraid it could trigger traumatic memories for some listeners. That said, I do want to share Daniel Rachel talking about the track's importance, and then I'll play our Bodysnatcher / Rhoda Dakar set of tunes, starting with the Bodysnatchers' signature tune, Let's Do Rocksteady, here on this Connecting Flights Two-Tone special on 90 FM.
What to say about the Bodysnatchers? I mean, I've got tapes given to me by the band of their first concerts on tour supporting the Select, and they're awful. They're stopping and starting and playing out of time and not quite getting it right. But then by the summer of 1980, they just sound brilliant. They've really nailed it, and they're more cohesive as a band. They've introduced a lot more of their own songs rather than covers of things like London Bridges Falling Down. And but it's an amazing story of class, and class is what defines British life, has always done, continues to do so. This was a class of working class, middle class, upper class, various different educations, a real hodgepodge, and it made up for some brilliant chapters in the book and stories that have never, to my knowledge, been told before. But the shining light on the Bodysnatchers should always be the song The Boiler, that they performed over 200 times in their set. And in their jaunty, rocksteady British version of Jamaican music, R&B, they would do this song about male violence and rape, and which was spoken by Rhoda Dakar and ends in her screaming the attack that she suffers from a man. And to be doing that throughout all of 1980 and the climate that we've talked about already in British society was quite extraordinary. And they should be remembered for that as much as anything. And thankfully, that version by the Bodysnatchers was recorded for a John Peel session. And he played it at least twice. And it's something worth listening out for. You may only be able to listen to it once, as the second listening is excruciatingly hard once you know what's coming. But it should be listened to because it tells us about male violence, and it's as prevalent in society today as it was when they were performing that song.
That was Rhoda Dakar collaborating with the Dub Pistols. The tune was Stand Together. And before that, the Bodysnatchers with Ruder Than You. Bringing us to the final vignette of this special two-tone edition of Connecting Flights. It's a story about the movement against apartheid, white minority rule in South Africa, and pushing for the release of political prisoner, freedom fighter Nelson Mandela. Two-Tone founder Jerry Dammers was quite active in the British anti-apartheid movement and wrote a song in honor of Mandela and calling for his freedom. Here again is author Daniel Rachel to tell the story.
Yeah, I mean, the single Nelson Mandela by the Special AKA has a chapter of its own in the book as a kind of an end piece. I played with the timeline of the effects of that record to end the book on a positive note, rather than the misery that was probably the true end of Two-Tone. But Nelson Mandela took on a life of its own after his release in 1984, not least because for kids like me, it introduced the whole idea of who he was and also who the African National Congress were, because it was on the flip side of the 7-inch vinyl. You could read a small piece about Mandela and the movement he belonged to. That wasn't something that we were being taught at school. I'd never heard of Nelson Mandela. I don't think, I'm not sure Jerry Dammers had until he'd gone to the birthday celebrations in North London a couple of years earlier and found out about him. But the more magnificent aspect of that single is when Two-Tone was falling apart. Jerry Dammers orchestrated an anti-apartheid demonstration in South London. 250,000 people came. It was the biggest anti-apartheid demonstration in the world, I think, at that point. That immediately led to the concert at Wembley Stadium, and then a second one in 1990. And, you know, when you've got the likes of Stevie Wonder and Whitney Houston and Annie Lennox performing on stage and then joining in for the finale of Nelson Mandela, it's quite something. I mean, what can top that? Only one thing, and that would be Nelson Mandela walking on stage as a free man, and that's exactly what happened. But the best bit is after the celebration of that concert in 1990, Mandela was introduced to Jerry Dammers, and Jerry was there, bated breath. What's the great man going to say to me? You know, I've tried to play my part. And Mandela turned to Dammers and just said, "Very good."
Free, 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 Nelson Mandela.
Is the freedom of the nation, when every man will be equal in the eyes of the Lord.
After Jerry Dammers and the Special AKA tune about South Africa and Father of the Nation Nelson Mandela. Just now, that was the late South African reggae star Lucky Dubé with House of Exile. All right, now we are coming up to the last set of this edition of Connecting Flights, this special edition. A huge thank you goes out to Daniel Rachel for sharing so much of what he learned in writing his excellent book about two-tone, Too Much Too Young. In a minute, I'll be playing the specials tune from which he took his book title. But before I head out, a big thanks to everyone for listening to the show this week. Have a great weekend. Stay warm, everybody.